So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Jaron Bradley. I think I was supposed to have something prepared to talk about Jaron, but I'm just going to kind of wing this. Jaron's a really good friend of mine. He works at CrowdStrike, used to live on the Big Island, so I thought it was only fitting that we kick off the conference with a talk from kind of a local Kama'aina speaker. He's going to be talking about some really cool stuff he does at CrowdStrike, and so without further ado, let's give a round of applause for Mr. Jaron Bradley.
Thank you for that. Let's see. All right. Let's get situated here. All right. Hello, everybody, and thanks so much for having me here at Objective by the Sea. I get to put on my resume now that I am the first speaker at the first ever Objective by the Sea, and I think that's going to be worth something someday. So. Really stoked to be here. Like Patrick said, I lived for some time on the Big Island and absolutely loved it. So this is a great way for me to come back and use it as an excuse to go visit some friends over in Hilo. And it's been an awesome week. And yeah, super stoked to be here and see some of the talks that are coming up. So what I want to talk to today, I bring you a presentation called MacDoored. So this is actually just a look into some of the analysis we've been doing on different attacker post-exploitation. So in recent years, we've seen a whole lot of posts on Windows and on attackers moving around in networks and what commands they're using and different exploits and all this stuff. But that's kind of remained a bit of a mystery on Mac. And in the past few years, we've seen a lot of backdoors come to light. We've seen a lot of vulnerabilities come to light on macOS. But what the attackers are doing after they use those backdoors and get into the system has still remained a bit of a mystery. So hopefully I can shed some light on that for you today if you're not familiar with it. Just a little bit about me. Like I said, my name's Jaron. I started as an incident responder and just absolutely loved it, really got into it. When I saw this whole endpoint thing coming to light, I wanted to get involved with that. So I moved to CrowdStrike, where I've been now about 5 years, just over that, and it's been great. So I'd initially come over after CrowdStrike had set up this infrastructure where we were collecting data from endpoints, and they needed analysts to go through the data and write detections with it and do the analysis on it. And I focused a lot on macOS because I felt like it was a platform that just wasn't getting enough attention. So I focused on it so much that I eventually got asked to move to the engineering team, where I put some of the sensor detections in place at the sensor level, which was a whole lot of fun. And then finally, I've moved to a research team called Strategic Counter Adversarial Research, or SCAR, if you will. And on that team, it's just a small team of us who have been at the company for a while, where we're able to focus on still writing detections and still doing that macOS research that I've been doing, but enabling new systems for analysts to write detections themselves. So it's been a whole lot of fun. I am also an author of OSX Incident Response Scripting and Analysis. Yes, OSX is in the title instead of macOS. I released this book after about a year of working on it, and then I think it was like 2 weeks later, Apple changed the name of the operating system. So like 2 weeks in, my book title was already outdated, but a lot of the content in it is still relevant, so if you like what you see today, feel free to check that out on Amazon. This is back when Patrick was doing a whole bunch of blog posts. It's all pretty much just a copy and paste job anyway, so. No questions. So just a bit of what we're going to cover today. Mainly, we're going to walk through just an attacker session where they had come into a network and moved around and done a whole bunch of stuff. So we'll focus mainly on one scenario and one use case, but I'll have a couple different things in here. So that's primarily what we're going to focus on here. Just before we get into it, the importance of the process tree. So with the endpoint, we put a lot of focus in our hunting on process tree behavior in general. So in my screenshots, you'll see a whole lot of process trees because that's how we do our hunting for the most part. But basically we do this because the process tree gives you context into a detection or event that occurred. In this case, the sudoers file being modified is just a silly little example. But if you have a user on the system, you want to give him sudo permissions, you can go to the etc sudoers file, and you can add him to that. And now you have the capability to use sudo. So let's say if we cared about that happening, we might write a little event for that. And in this case, the context is we see the parent of that, or we see the reason that file was modified was due to Vim, which is manually. Nobody really uses Vim to automate stuff. Maybe we do. I don't. But the parent of that is Bash, which is pretty typical. And then in this case, the parent is Jamf, or third-party administrative software. So based on this process tree, we can kind of make the assumption that this was probably an administrator coming in and adding the user to the sudoers file. As we're in the second process tree, you follow it up the chain, you see Vim was still responsible, but up the chain we see that a file called A running out of the temp directory was actually responsible. And if you've done any incident response, you'll know that single letter executables doing suspicious things are never usually a good sign. This is just an example of how we use process tree hunting. Here's another use case. This is actually a real-world use case. Here at the bottom of the screen, at the bottom of the process tree, you see the commands dscl, plutil, defaults, and tr. Now, these process trees are usually interactive for us, so we can click on them, see the command lines, see the file paths of where they ran and all that, but all I have is a screenshot to work with here, so bear with me. So these commands getting executed are generally assigned that passwords were dumped from the ds local nodes file. So what this is doing, the attacker actually set up something to go and dump the hashes for every single user. So using these commands, you can kind of reconstruct a hash and then crack it offline wherever you want. That's kind of yellow flag number one. Down at the bottom there, passwords being dumped. Some software, Puppet for example, will go through and actually try and help manage some password information, and therefore it will access the shadow hash data. So you can't just assume because the shadow hash data was accessed that something malicious was done. There's a lot of analysis that goes into it. But in this case, if you take the parent of the password dumping commands, you'll see that it's a randomly named 8-letter process. And if I could click on that, you would see that it's running out of the temp directory. So once again, pretty suspicious. The parent of that is a 4-letter process running once again out of the temp directory. So that's another yellow flag is temp directory processes dumping the passwords. Just a little bit shady there. And then finally, to top it all off, if you take this a step higher, we see that the ultimately responsible for this is the Google Chrome helper process. That is the browser renderer and not Google Chrome itself. So really, the browser renderer definitely has no reason to be dumping passwords or running anything out of the temp directory. Its behavior should be very limited in terms of any type of execs. So this was something we found in the wild, an actor using to exploit Google Chrome in some manner. This is a while back at this point, but it's still my kind of proof of concept for hey, like bad stuff gets developed for Mac too. This was definitely targeted at Mac users and not something that we saw happening on Windows anywhere. So pretty cool. All right, so before I get into the intrusion, just some detection and analysis difficulties. If you've been working on Mac to do security, you're probably aware that there are some hiccups, like some stuff is very difficult. These are just some of the major things that I note. And one of those big things is all the commands an attacker could ever need are already on the operating system. So this idea of living off the land that is now on Windows is kind of it's not a new concept, but we see more actors trying to enforce that living off the land idea with PowerShell and with more script-based backdoors and that type of thing. As where on Unix, Linux, Mac, like that concept has been around forever. So attackers getting on Unix systems are already pretty familiar with the ways they can go about attacking it without having to download a whole bunch of extra tools. Now, some actors still choose to, which is interesting to me. I think living off the land is much more stealthy, but I'll get into that a little bit later. So because these commands have been around forever and living off the land isn't a new concept on Unix, admin and attacker activity can frequently look like the same thing. These tools that attackers are using, admins are also using, and so are developers. So I'll get into some of those examples in a little bit, but that's one of the most difficult parts in analysis, is knowing a false positive from a developer or from an admin versus what's actually attacker activity. Backdoor is being written in many different languages, so it's not just Mach-O executables you got to worry about. You got to worry about a lot of different scripting languages and a lot of different backdoors written in those languages. And those hashes can change on the fly by just adding a space, to your script. So that can sometimes make things more difficult. And then finally, the malware sample size being a lot smaller. Now, like I said, this is beginning to change, and we're seeing more Mac malware. But compared to Windows, right, it's a very small sample set. Taking what we can from those malware samples that do exist and being able to write detections from them is very important at this state especially. Okay, so the intrusion that I'll actually be walking through, this is just kind of an example of a process tree, a standard process tree that would be created by the attacker on almost every system he made it onto. So the attacker would come in through SSH. On most systems, they got to the network. We highly suspect a spearfish that occurred. And then with that spearfish, they had credentials ready to move about around the network, and I'll get into that once I get to the lateral movement section. But when you log in with SSH, a new SSHD instance is created, and naturally you get a new shell, and then everything spawning from that shell would then be attacker activity. So recon, not super interesting, it's recon, but there's some important notes to take away from it. So coming in through SSH, recon always came first. I thought it was interesting to note that the attacker would run some of the Mac unique commands for recon, and this actually tells us that he knew he was targeting a Mac. We see a lot of attackers like just running SSH brute forcers, and they end up getting into a system, and then they run some Linux commands even though they don't realize they're on a Mac system. So the attacker knew what they were targeting in this case, because they jump into running the Mac specific commands right away. And SWVers, this just kind of spits back some basic information about the version of OS X you're on. System profiler, you use the right arguments, and you get just a huge dump of hardware information and all this. Basically, it's the extremely long version of SWVers. DSCL list users, again, Mac-specific, or more Mac-specific. Just a way to kind of cat the etc password file, but say, show me the users and the service users without having to see the extra noise. And then ping, obviously not Mac specific, but I note this because of how frequently it was used. Instead of bringing a scanner of some type, an Nmap scanner, a port scanner, or whatever, they would actually just ping every system they could. And they do it all manually, they wouldn't script it out, so just in this log of commands we have, it's just a massive amount of ping commands. -C1 saying, just ping once and then stop. Dig was also used a lot to investigate different systems. And then another interesting one I thought was the DNS-SD command. If you don't know this one, check out the man page. It's actually pretty interesting, and it replaces the old mdns command. It basically allows you to do a kind of like a scan for the Bonjour-enabled systems that are broadcasting some services. So in this case, the attacker would scan for other systems that were broadcasting SSH. And that's all in the man page. And it's a pretty cool command, but kind of built in really good recon for an attacker to have access to. Okay, so the backdoor. So the attacker coming in over SSH would not be his main way to maintain persistence and log in and all that. After he came in through SSH, he would set up a backdoor, all done manually through manual commands. He didn't script it out or anything, and this was multiple systems that he was moving laterally about. So coming in through SSH, the first command you see there at the top is what would be executed first after all the recon. So this IP address hosted a number of different tools. And in this case, the attacker is downloading a binary called TSSD. This is a MacOS executable. And so he'd pull that down, give it executable permissions, and then rename it to something something that blends in a little better. In this case, rutil. So macOS includes a binary on it already called r2util. So this just I don't know, looks like r1util or something. He thinks, I don't know. He renames it, and he's working out of the user local bin directory in this case. So we now have an executable called user local bin rutil. The touch command, I'll get into that in the cleanup section. Looks at it with ls and then vims a file etc.cache, hidden file in the etc folder, and this actually just contains a masked C2 and the port number inside of it, masked by some XOR key, I believe. Finally, he changes the permissions on it so somebody's less likely to stumble into it. So that was not the only backdoor we saw in this single intrusion. In fact, there was a lot more, but there were 3 in this intrusion that the attacker would actually pull down, and it seemed like he'd pull them down based on the version of OS X he was on. Now, we only got one of these binaries actually back to play with, so that might not be accurate. He could also just be pulling down different versions of the backdoor so that static analysis is less likely to uncover him, or so that the same hash doesn't exist on 3 different systems or whatever. But we saw three different hashes at play here, all behaving like the same backdoor, but with different hashes. The IP address is actually, if you go back quite a few years to a Blue Coat report, I want to say 2011 or something like that, the IP address is actually associated with WinNTI group, or who we call Wicked Panda. It is interesting that this IP was reported and has still stuck around in their arsenal for so long. There was also a ProtectWise blog post that came out, I think it was last year, that spoke to a lot of the same details, seeing the same IP address used in spear phishing campaigns against macOS systems. So the attribution comes from knowing just the history of this IP address and that it's been used before. So. The backdoor itself, Virustotal actually, when we were originally doing the analysis on this, Virustotal didn't have anything, and I think only had maybe even just one of the hashes we were actually trying to investigate, but even that hash had 0 hits in it from scanners. Now, if you check it out, you'll see most of it actually rings up as kidnap from a lot of vendors. I don't see any signs of it being kidnap. I haven't done the reversing myself, but what our reversers noticed is that this does appear to be a variant of TinyShell, which is pretty popular on Unix. It's just a really small remote shell wrapper kind of, and it works really well for attackers to use, and that's what we noticed it was. It also has a config file, which I don't think Kidnap had any type of config file associated with it. Kidnap also did a really popular technique to dump passwords from SecurityD. When it could get plain text passwords from that, and even on the outdated systems that we saw the attacker land on, we didn't see that technique used. So. Could be a variant. I'm not sure. Like I said, didn't do the reversing myself, but we saw a notable relationship to like a ported version of TinyShell, as far as we could tell. This is just a screenshot showing on one system the attacker had named the backdoor to PRL monitor instead of rutil. And here it's communicating with the IP address, the same IP address, mind you, that is hosting the tools. So the attacker is pulling down tools from the same IP address as he's connecting his backdoor to on port 53, maybe to try and blend in with DNS or something. I don't know. Yeah, a lot of times we'll see the actors obviously host a tool server one place and the C2 connecting elsewhere so that, if one IP address gets blown, at least the other one doesn't, but that wasn't the case here. Curl all the things, so curl is just widely used in intrusions in general. We see a lot of curl activity once an attacker makes it into the network. Like I said, living off the LAN should be something a little more popular, but Wicked Panda in this case is just running a lot of curl commands. I post these here because I think they're kind of funny. It shows the attacker screwing up quite frequently. It seems like through the back door that they come in, they have some type of encoding issue, because you can see them trying to curl down 5.text, which is clearly a bash script, and then piping it to bash. But after that, you see just this series of crazy, %20 pipe, %20, like there even needs to be a space between those. So it's just, you can nearly see the guy smashing his head on the keyboard by the end, and ultimately gives up, and we never saw that 5.text run. So yeah, a lot of curl activity. We also see a lot of curl activity in the sense, and this is on Linux where we see this, where we've seen this more. I don't think I've seen it on Mac yet, but it would work just the same, as we see PNG files being hosted on popular, photo sharing sites, and in that PNG file will be Bash script or Python script of some type, or some type of scripting language. And the attacker will pull that PNG file down with curl, pipe it to DD, and then go to the offset where that script is held, and then pipe that to the interpreter language. So it's kind of this nice way to make traffic look a little less suspicious, and that you're going to a popular web host or picture hosting site, and then the PNG file and the malicious code never hits the hard drive. Instead, it just goes straight to the Bash interpreter or Python interpreter or anything like that. A quick hunting note using that as a use case. So like I said, curl is used in a lot of intrusions that we see, so keep an eye on suspicious curl commands in your environment is pretty important. If you're tracking process-based activity, there's a couple different ways to do that. The first is kind of the easy catch way, where if you can do searches of command line activity, you can do a search for any shell type command where curl comes first, and then like a star and then DD, or a curl star and then a pipe. This is a lot easier if you're at a small company where you're able to actually really know what's going on with curl, and whether developers are using it or admins or attackers. But that's one way to go about it. The other that I find a little more thorough is, if you have the capability, would be to find the times where curl runs where it is the process group ID leader, right? So when you run the string of commands and pipes like this, you'll see that curl actually becomes the process group ID leader because it's executed first. So if you can find times where curl ran, where the process ID matches the process group ID, that tells you that curl was the process group ID leader. And then you can do some unique searches for show me times where curl was the process group ID leader and ran with DD, and ran with Bash or Python, so on, so forth. But I just bring that up because, yeah, can't emphasize this enough. Seen curl in like every intrusion that we've handled. Some more whoops from the attacker. If you're familiar with pen testing on Mac or anything like that, you've probably tried to use NetCat, and if you tried to use the -E to use a shell over NetCat, you know that the BSD NetCat does not have that -E switch to actually let you use that shell back and forth. The actor tried this numerous times, which was surprising because he did seem to be pretty knowledgeable of the operating system, and this seems like such a basic thing to not know. But then he tries some syntax that I'm almost positive wouldn't even work on Linux. But finally, the last command he runs, he tries something different. He gives up on NetCat and he tries to make a PTY type node with the make node command, and then he tries to use that with telnet to connect back to the C2. And the make node command on macOS does not have the PTY type, so once again, this command fails. Persistence. All right, so persistence, the actor shows actually, he shows a little bit more that he's knowledgeable of the operating system. I probably don't need to cover these in like raw detail because most of us here have already covered persistence on Mac and how launch daemons work and how launch agents work. With the high-level summary, we got 3 different points. We have the system integrity protected level that only Apple can write to, right? And that's system library launch daemons. And then the root level, just library launch daemons. This is where we see the majority of actors and malware writing to, I'd say. And then finally, the user level for if the attacker can't gain root permissions for some reason. So again, the root level is where we see the majority of malware being written to, and the system level can no longer, unless you have a SIP bypass of some type, you can no longer write to that location. And that reason, well, one of the reasons is because malware can easily blend in if it just calls itself com.apple.something, and it's sitting inside the system library launch daemons directory. It's going to blend in with about 100 other launch daemons, and nobody's ever going to think none the wiser. So that's a good move on Apple's part. It's just a simple, and from what we've seen, pretty effective, because it's been forcing actors to write to the library launch daemons directory instead. So what the actor does, like I said, pretty standard practice. They manually create that launch daemon. They call it com.apple.accessprinter.plist, and they place it inside the library launch daemons directory. And then they go ahead and load it. So there is a yellow flag here once again, and that's the fact that we see a com.apple item inside the library launch daemons directory. Should be in the system directory. Now that's not true to every single piece of Apple software. I've seen some still end up in there. But really, if you see a com.apple item in the library launch daemons directory, it's worth looking into and at least making sure it points at something legitimate. And that's a pretty easy win right there. And then they go ahead and load it with launch control load. So more than just a system check, on some systems the actor ended up on, they would come in through SSH, and they'd start, instead of doing some, part of their recon process would be to touch a file to user bin, and they just call it something simple like X. So user bin is another location that is protected by system integrity protection. So you could call this just a permissions check, but I think it's more of a SIP check. What you see is that he removes the file after, telling us that he successfully wrote it. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, maybe we got a system integrity protection exploit. Sweet, this will be awesome. But you can see the actor looks surprised that he can do that as well, because now he's running all these recon commands to see what version of the operating system he's running on. Turns out, yeah, this was a Yosemite system, which is I believe the last flavor to not allow you, or that did not enable SIP. So no bypass here, just an outdated system, a little less interesting. Yosemite persistence, so once he would realize that, sure enough, we would see him target the system library launch daemons directory. So once he confirmed that he could blend in better with the operating system, he went ahead and did that. So good practice on his part in making that happen. And this, like I said, this is exactly why Apple actually, has enabled things like SIP and not allowing you to write to the system library directory, because attackers are doing it, blending in with the operating system, and you'll never be any the wiser. So he goes ahead and writes that there and then loads it just like he would have, still using the touch command. I promise I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah. Persistence piggybacking, this is a term I made up. I'm not really sure it's a thing, but it's what we saw. So in this case, we saw the attacker read the login hooks that were available, and at the time, login hooks were deprecated but still working, which might even be true to now. Can't remember exactly. But at this time, at least, login hooks were still working, and they were known as deprecated. So in this, he looks to see what login hooks are enabled, and he sees that Jamf is actually running login hooks. Sure enough, the next command we see is a vim of the Jamf login hook. This is another reason login hooks were actually deprecated, because they were known to have security issues. This is a view of the Jamf login hook before any editing is done. I don't have a copy of what the attacker actually did, but presumably he puts his backdoor inside that login hook somewhere. So now when Jamf kicks off, so does the attacker backdoor service. And it's just a way to stay completely out of the library launch daemons directory and not really have to create his own persistence, living off the land and being wiser in that sense. So cleanup. When the attacker would come in, as you've seen, like through some of the NetCat commands and through some of just the really noisy commands, the attacker was not the stealthiest. it wasn't bad per se, and most people aren't really worried about being caught on macOS systems, so they don't think there's much need for stealth. But yeah, there's a lot of commands executed in this time window. So there were some minor stealth practices, like they were really good about cleaning up files they were done with, different scripts that they had written. They made sure to delete so nobody could take from the hard drive or anything. They were pretty good about that. The touch command that you've been seeing shot after shot here is another command that they ran very frequently. And if you've done pen testing, once again, you're probably familiar with this. The touch command actually takes the timestamps from one file and applies those to another file, the touch-r command, sorry. So in this case, he takes the legitimate R2util binary, he takes the timestamps from that, and he applies it to his backdoor, rutil. Does the same with the etc profile file. He takes those timestamps and applies it to his backdoor configuration file. And then finally, the touch-r command on the Cisco AnyConnect. Basically, he looks in the launch daemons directory to find a random launch daemon, and he takes the Cisco one and takes the timestamps from that and applies it to his launch daemon. So just making sure this is going to throw off your your standard timeline analysis. So if you're doing like incident response in that sense, where you're collecting all the information from the files. And you're getting a list of the different timestamps, this will throw you off. This can throw you for a curveball and make some of your analysis more difficult. So it's good practice on him to go out of the way to do that. A lot of technologies, this isn't going to change the game a whole lot, but it might slow down some forensics. Lastly, when he would SSH into systems, he would use the user known host file and redirect it to dev null. This is just the file that in SSH, the little pop-up that comes up and says, this is the first time you're logging into this box. Do you want to log it to known hosts or whatever? And you put yes. And this is just making sure that doesn't get logged anywhere, even if you do type yes. So good practice there too, but overall, really noisy activity on the command line and some minor stealth when it came to just making sure they cleaned up the basic stuff. Lateral movement, so no surprise here that SSH was pretty much at play the whole time. The actor had actually managed to gain credentials to an admin user that existed on a lot of different boxes throughout build environments and on some different, I think some different user systems. So with that admin username and password, they were able to move around really easily. Some of the typical commands you see for lateral movement on Mac match pretty identical to the ones you would expect to see on Linux as well. So that's grepping for SSH usage inside the bash history. If you land on a standard user system, you could come up totally empty here. But since they had this admin creds, really there was quite a bit of SSH commands for them to dig through, it seemed. So just going through the bash history and looking for SSH is really popular. Looking at the known host file, this will outlast the bash history probably, so it's also a really easy place to look for just recent IP addresses that have been SSH'd into. And then not entirely related to lateral movement, but related to SSH, they would pull down a file called rs that was hosted once again on their server, and then using the -f switch for SSH, they would load that rs config file in. So it ended up being a config file for SSH, which you can manually load your own config when you run SSH with the -f switch there. So once again, using the user known host file, redirecting to dev null, and so when you kick that off, you end up on another system, a new instance of SSHD and bash is created, and you start all over at recon. So that's the typical behavior we saw for lateral movement. Really, one set of bad stolen credentials just turns into a big show. This is just a screenshot of another quick hunting tip. If you don't have a massive amount of logs to go through, but you do have process tree information and process timestamp information, You can, on a lot of systems like SSH will be set up to, for some users, if they are an admin user, they don't have to enter their password, they just are greeted with a root shell, right? This is a way to tell that the actor, or a way to assume that the actor actually had the username and password, because the time between sudo running and a shell spawning after that was anywhere from 3 to 7 seconds. So sometimes it'd be 3 seconds, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, 6, 7, which is right about the amount of time it takes to type in a password. So that's an assumption, but if you don't have logs to go off of based on those process timestamps, you can make a pretty safe assumption for that. PTY and TTY. I include this because I think it translates nicely to all the stuff we see on Windows with PowerShell encoded commands. This is kind of the equivalent, at least done in Python. You can do it in any language. Obviously, that includes a base 64 decoding library. But essentially, we have times where the attacker would have a connection from one system to another, but he wouldn't have that TTY where he could type in sudo and then it'd prompt him for a password and he could type it in. When he didn't have that TTY, he would run this really popular command. So I've decoded it there, easy peasy. It's just the import pty spawn bin bash. And this actually just creates a TTY where there isn't one, and he's now able to interact with sudo and punch in the credentials that he's aware of. So why he chooses to encode this in base 64, I'm not really sure. In fact, it's just longer in base 64. I guess he just thought it was more stealthy. Generally, though, if you see something shady happening and then you see it was all done in base 64, you can make a pretty safe assumption that it's something shady and not an admin. So yeah, just some base 64 practice there. And we're seeing that a little bit more and more on both Linux and Mac. So for this attack, those are the static indicators. You're welcome to go grab those. I gave a very similar talk at ShakaCon this year, so those are being hosted on my GitHub if you want just a YAR rule full of these indicators, and that just includes the hashes for the 3 different backdoors we saw, the IP, the file names. So that is a single attack in this case. That was all part of one attack. I'm going to cover just a brief separate attack. So this is not the same thing. I put Wicked Pandas here in question mark because I have no proof that this is Wicked Panda. There's definitely no set attribution to this. What you can recognize is a lot of the command syntax does look pretty familiar, but that doesn't tell us anything guaranteed in terms of attribution. But I do think it's interesting that there are a lot of commonalities. So for those of you that follow my Twitter or follow CrowdStrike, you'll see we actually tweeted a lot of this out yesterday, where an attacker was once again using curl to pull down a backdoor, in this case called software update D. That's to blend in with the operating system processes because there already is a software update D. It runs out of the system directory, but the attacker in this case has once again put it in user local bin. And they pull it down once again from a straight IP address, no domain involved, hosted on a privileged port 11, and then it's just labeled ASD on their tools server. So give executable permissions to that, run it, and now they have the backdoor once again running on the system. They actually ran this a couple times. They would run the backdoor, forget to escalate to sudo, so rerun the backdoor as sudo, well logged into the backdoor, and it just created this massive, hilarious process tree. But after the backdoor was installed, persistence was actually set up, so for some reason, on the tools side, on their server, they would just rename the launch daemon, or they would just take the launch daemon and rename it to ASD, so they could then run the same curl command and get a new file. You can see that because the next command that gets run takes that ASD file that they downloaded and moves it to the library launch daemons directory, and this time it's called local.localhost.startup.plist. Shout out to Objective-C at this point, because if you're running block or something like that, this should be a pretty big red flag, like local.localhost.startup.plist. That's going to be something either someone just Googled and doesn't know what name to create a launch daemon with, or it's going to be, some new developer who is also trying to learn. So if this gets created on your system, check it out, look into it. You probably see it points to something interesting if you don't know what it is. And obviously a power user might know that, but a standard user, even if they're running block, might just allow it or not know what they're looking at. Still being able to go in and look at suspicious launch daemons, like in some remote fashion, is still really important. Just monitoring your launch daemons and knowing what's running on the system. And then I also include in this shot just the SSH command, once again, user known host file being redirected to devnull from whoever this actor happens to be as well, and then strict host key checking set to no, which we saw every time SSH was executed in this environment. Pastebin, so like you see with Windows and a lot of intrusions, we saw curls out to Pastebin. After the actor would get the code they wanted off Pastebin, they would delete it pretty quickly, because we were on their toes pretty quick for a lot of this, and it came down very quick. On Pastebin, they were actually hosting Perl code. I feel like it's malicious shenanigans is the only thing Perl gets used for these days, but sure enough, the attacker goes to Pastebin to pull that down and then executes Perl by itself, presumably pasting that entire script into the PowerShell. All right, and then finally Exfil, and I bring this up because I think a lot of times with our detections and our focus, we look to a lot of points in the kill chain, like before Exfil. Obviously, we want to catch everything before Exfil, but there are ways we can detect on Exfil, and I think we often overlook that sometimes. And even though it's the last stage that you pray to God the attacker doesn't get to, it's still important to have detection set up for. So I just want to shed a little light on what the attacker did in this case for his Exfil. And that was, he would once again run the curl command. He would pull down a binary he called update from the same IP address. He'd give it executable permissions, and then he'd use a number of staging commands that should be no surprise here. You know, find commands, ls commands. He was rsynching data down from remote servers, just so he'd have fully updated versions before he actually did the Exfil. So, and then finally, like every time we saw this staging done and these commands run, we would see the nohup binary run in front of this new update tool, whatever it was. So nohup just allows for basically says ignore hangups or make this thing I'm about to specify hangup immune. We actually see it run with a lot of attacker backdoors. So again, if you're in a small environment, it might be an easy thing to keep an eye on nohup and what's running behind that. But if you're in a big environment, it might be a little bit harder. So anyway, the attacker runs this through some unique Googling of the command line arguments. I was actually able to be brought back to the tool itself that this update binary was. I assumed it was homegrown, but sure enough, it's actually an admin tool, purely administrative, hosted on rootkidder.com, which, so there's an updated version of this called Termite, but the attacker is using the old version that you're actually seeing here. At the bottom right there, you'll see a syntax that actually should look quite familiar, and that's the syntax that the attacker was running. And if you use Google Chrome or whatever to translate this from Chinese, you get start sock v5 server on host B, which will transfer the data to port, whatever of host A. So the attacker was using this third-party tool to do Exfil. I still think Exfil can be done pretty easily with about 1 million commands that already exist on Mac. Zipping files and stuff like that was not really of much concern. He was just taking the raw files and shipping them off. So in this case, the tool, the syntax that they use just lets you do this it appears to just let you do this big transfer. I haven't used the tool myself, but it just takes the data from the host and sends it straight to the C2. It looks like it has options. If you read through some of the different parts of the tool, it looks like it actually has options to kind of tunnel through the network a bit more than that. And if you can't get your data from the current box you're on to your C2, it seems like it has some built-in features maybe to allow propagating back through the network and then back to the C2, assuming you've infected a couple different nodes on the system. So seeing this used on macOS for Exfil purposes is it's a good indicator of at least what one adversary is using to exfil data. The hash wasn't modified in any way. It was just straight downloaded from the site. And I believe there's also a GitHub for this tool, and it was open source, if I'm not mistaken. So available for modifications. But that being said, yeah, Exfil I think is an important stage to actually monitor, and something we should still be worrying about, even though it's all the way at the end of the kill chain. So with that is my presentation. That's all I have for you guys. I think we got time for maybe a couple questions, if anybody has anything. Yeah. How does it affect?
Does it also cool FS events thinking that all the rewrites don't happen at the other time, or does FS events have that true?
That should be. Yeah. The question is how does touch-r affect FS events? And I've never actually played with that, if I'm being honest. Has anybody know?
If you're streaming FS events live, you should probably.
Yeah, I would think as well. If you're streaming FS events live, then you should probably see that happen. I don't think you'd be affected in the same manner. Yeah. Yeah.
Who do you see the pandas kind of generally targeting? Do they have certain
Wicked Panda in general, at least on Mac. Yeah. Sorry. So who do we see Wicked Panda targeting? I can say at least on Mac, we've seen them target a lot of different technology companies, and I know that's vague, but it has to be. But so mainly mainly technology companies and like actual companies, and not just yeah, sorry, I should be able to get into that more, but technology companies, I'm going to leave it at that.
places with computers?
Yeah, places with computers. Yeah. All right, cool. You got this?
Awesome. So round of applause again for Jaron. Thanks, Jaron.
Thanks, man.
Expect you to be talking at Objective by the Sea version 2.0 as well. It's always great to hear a talk where we actually see real live data from actual adversaries. So that's pretty cool.